Alright guys, so welcome back. This is chapter 54, part 2, and this is going to be a relatively short sequence. Here we're just going to take a look a little bit at species diversity within a community. So what are we really trying to describe? Well, we're trying to talk about the variety of different kinds of organisms that we see making up a particular community. And when we talk about species diversity, we've got to define two pieces to this. First is your species richness. So simply talking about the number of different species that we see. All right, and so if we take a look at the figures on the right there, species richness is going to be the same in both of those communities. There are 4 different types of tree species that we see in these different communities. But then we also have to take into consideration the relative abundance or the proportions that we see each species representing within that community. All right, in some instances, that might be more telling than just that species richness. Because if we take a look at those figures, all right, community 1, we've got a relatively nice distribution for each species. 25% for type A, 25% for type B, same for C and D. All right, so it's a relatively diverse community based on sort of the average person's understanding of what diversity looks like. All right, we go down to community 2, and although its species richness is the same in that we've got 4 different types of species, this would be a community that most people would say is not very diverse. And that's because just looking around, we've got 80% of the community being made up by a single species, where B and C are 5% themselves, respectively, and D is 10%. So, how do we really put a number to this as an ecologist? Well, again, although those species both have the same richness, their relative abundance is majorly different. All right, and so when we want to describe species diversity from a statistical standpoint or from a quantitative analysis, one of the ways we can do that is to use what they call the Shannon Diversity Index. And that's really what you're looking at down here. As far as actually calculating this, we're not really going to spend any time on it. For the AP exam, it's not really a big deal, but the basic principle behind it is helpful. All right, and the purpose to this index is to take a look at all those different species that we see. All right, so A, B, C, D, E, F, so on and so forth, depending on how many different things you have in your community. And taking a look at the number of different species we see, all right, and multiplying that by their relative abundance of each, as well as what we call the natural log. And depending on where you are in your math studies at this point, you may understand what that means, you may not, which is why we don't really spend a lot of time calculating it. But the basic idea here is that you're going to see drastically different indices for this community versus this one. All right, and that's simply because the relative abundance is much more diverse up here than it is down here in community 2. So what does that tell us from an ecological standpoint? All right, well, it's one thing that we work on in sort of test communities to manipulate. All right, how much of an impact do those richnesses versus relative abundances make a difference for different species, for different community structures? All right, this picture happens to be a test plot set up at Penn State. All right, so it is something that they spend a lot of time looking at. But ultimately, what we end up finding, sort of as a general statement, is that communities that have a higher diversity, all right, so both the number of different species we see as well as that relative abundance sort of combined, is that they're more productive, they're more stable in their productivity, and they're a lot more resistant to both general human disturbances, natural disturbances, wildfires, and that sort of thing, drought in terms of environmental stresses, all right, as well as just being resistant to invasives. All right, the more diverse they are, the more they're able to kind of keep their structure, keep their relative abundances, keep their number of different species going than if you have a much less diverse population. All right, so the more diversity we see, the better off that community structure is. Is sort of the take home message behind all of this.